I became interested in sturgeon through several avenues. One is that as a scientist, as an angler, I was always intrigued by those charismatic, highly migratory fishes that spawn in rivers and go to the ocean and come back and are subject to interesting fisheries. Sturgeon are unique because they are living fossils in effect. These species have not changed in 200 million years. We have sturgeon around the New York City region. They spawn in the Hudson, the Atlantic sturgeon, but they migrate to the ocean, so they pass by New York City, and they're very difficult to see because they're large fish in the bottoms of a murky river. Sturgeon have declined in the Hudson River historically, but not as badly as elsewhere. In fact, the Hudson River population of Atlantic sturgeon was rather robust until recent years. The really major crash for Atlantic sturgeon, which is the same species along the entire coast here that was fished heavily, occurred in the Delaware River, where in the late 1800s, the 1890s, there was an international caviar craze. There was a sort of a gold rush in the Delaware River, which had by far the largest population of Atlantic sturgeon on the East Coast, and for several years there was rampant overfishing. In the 1970s, PCBs, a contaminant, were discovered in the Hudson River, and this restricted fishing for most species in the Hudson River, and commercial fishermen were left with very few species they could actually fish for, just blue crab, American shad, and sturgeon. So they focused more and more on sturgeon in response to what was happening in the Hudson and the fact that they had not recovered in other rivers along the East Coast. The Atlantic states, as a group, decided to impose a 40-year moratorium on any fishing for Atlantic sturgeon. So right now, these fish are blessed with this blanket of protection that still has about 30 years to go. Sturgeon are rather pollution tolerant. Even when the Hudson was as badly polluted as a river can be in the mid-1900s, the sturgeon were still there. However, the real interesting recovery occurred for the minor species, the short-nosed sturgeon. They like to spawn way upriver in the area of Albany, and Albany had an incredible sewage problem throughout most of the 1900s. It was so bad that the sewage from the Albany area would overwhelm the upper Hudson and create this dead zone called the Albany Pool, where no life occurred in the summer. In the 1970s, the Hudson was estimated to have about 15,000 short-nosed sturgeon in it. And after the Clean Water Act created its miracles in New York Harbor and the Albany Pool and elsewhere around this country, the Albany Pool became available to these fish, and we had probably the greatest sturgeon recovery of any sturgeon species in the entire world. In a matter of 3 decades, we went from 15,000 short-nosed sturgeon to 60,000. So the Hudson is sort of a Shangri-La for sturgeon. The future of sturgeons, I think, is a real mixed bag. I think there are 2 or 3 species that are likely to go extinct, and there are others that will flourish and prosper. But I think the key factor that will really take the pressure off them is the continued development of aquaculture to produce caviar. There was a Russian scientist, a prominent Russian researcher, Sergei Doroshov, who defected to the U.S., I think in the 1970s, and he was settled at UC Davis in California and developed a cadre of young students working on sturgeon, white sturgeon biology, many of whom settled in the area and decided to use their knowledge to start to try to ranch sturgeon or farm sturgeon, mostly in inland areas far from the ocean. So I think the future for sturgeon is to develop this aquaculture industry and to take the pressure off the wild fish and to rely on caviar production from these farmed animals.